In the stillness of a Christmas morning, Grace, who was grappling with her own challenges, took a moment to offer kindness to an elderly man lost in sorrow at the church. What she didn't expect was that this small act would lead to a much bigger story, one neither of them could have imagined. As the man's hidden past slowly unraveled, Grace's life was changed forever, and she found herself drawn into a world where kindness became the driving force for transformation. This Christmas, not only did Grace offer help to someone in need, but in return, she discovered a connection that would forever alter the course of her life in ways she never anticipated. You'll find yourself asking, could one simple decision change everything? The story begins. On Christmas morning, Grace knelt in a quiet corner of the church, whispering a prayer. She prayed sincerely for kindness and peace to spread across the world, and asked for strength to overcome the daily struggles she faced. As her prayer ended, she stood up, adjusting her coat, a gentle smile lighting her face and her eyes sparkling with excitement for the day ahead. This Christmas, Grace had managed to save just enough to enjoy a special meal at her favorite Italian restaurant, a small luxury she hadn't dared to indulge in for months. For others, it might seem ordinary, but for Grace, it was something truly special. The cravings for her beloved pasta filled her with excitement as she thought of the small sacrifices she had made to save enough, like cutting back on coffee, skipping snacks, and making do with whatever spare change she had. Now, she could treat herself to a moment of relaxation and joy, a small occasion to forget about the struggles, if only for a brief while. With those thoughts in mind, Grace began walking toward the church exit. But as she passed a quieter corner, her steps slowed. Seated alone on a pew, away from the crowd, was an elderly man. At first, she thought he was simply resting, but as she drew nearer, she realized his shoulders were hunched, and his face was bowed, with silent tears falling onto the dry floor beneath him. Grace's heart tightened. Her excitement and hunger vanished as worry took hold. Something was clearly wrong. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach, but then decided to move forward. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, being careful not to startle him. The elderly man looked up, surprised to see someone near. He quickly wiped away his tears, trying to compose himself. For a long while, he said nothing, his lips pressed tightly together. Finally, he spoke in a choked voice. "It's nothing, just memories," he said faintly, attempting a smile that couldn't hide the sadness. Grace sat down beside him, maintaining a respectful distance to allow him comfort but still offering her willingness to listen. "Sometimes, just sharing your thoughts can make everything feel a little lighter," she said gently. "I'm here if you want to talk." The elderly man stared at her for a moment, then nodded. "I was hoping to spend Christmas with my family," he murmured. "I visited my son and saw my grandson, but they turned me away, said they had other plans." His voice faltered and he paused to take a weak breath. "I was really looking forward to seeing them, to being part of their lives, even if just for a day. But they didn't want me there. So, now here I am, spending Christmas alone. I don't even know why I came to the church. Maybe it was to feel a little less lonely." Grace's heart ached. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "No one should feel like this, especially today." Her voice was full of sympathy. The elderly man nodded weakly, wiping his eyes with a trembling hand. She stayed by his side, and after a moment of silence, she glanced down at her purse, almost instinctively touching it as if deciding something. An idea flashed in her mind. Though her plans for the day had been centered around her own small joy, she realized there was something more important she could do. The elderly man needed kindness and connection more than she needed that meal. She made up her mind not to let the elderly man spend Christmas alone. Rising to her feet, Grace softly spoke, "Wait here, I'll be right back." He nodded, though his gaze still held a trace of skepticism. Grace walked briskly toward the church door, her steps firm, as if she had already made a decision. As her figure disappeared from sight, the elderly man's shoulders sagged once more, and the familiar ache of loneliness crept back in, as if a part of him had resigned itself to face the silence again. But Grace had no intention of abandoning him. She entered a nearby shop, her heart set on bringing some small joy to the old man. She carefully selected a steaming cup of coffee and a warm pastry, hoping they would offer him a measure of comfort. As she approached the counter, a vibrant Christmas card caught her eye. She picked it up and, after a moment of hesitation, wrote a simple but hopeful message inside. Her words were meant to remind him that he was not alone this holiday and to bring him a small sense of cheer. At the counter, Grace counted her remaining cash. She realized that the modest amount she had saved for her own special meal was now spent on these small gifts. Yet, there was no hesitation. She remembered the prayer she had whispered in the church and knew that making the elderly man smile, even if just for a moment, mattered more than any meal she could have. This act of kindness was the true joy of her day. After paying the $55 bill, Grace left the store with a small bag containing the simple yet meaningful gifts. She made her way back to the church, her heart filled with warmth. As she neared the pew, she saw the elderly man still sitting there, his head bowed, lost in thought. Before approaching him, Grace cleared her throat gently and extended the cup of coffee toward him. "Here," she said softly. "This is for you." The elderly man looked up, his weary eyes flickering with surprise. A hint of disbelief crossed his face as his gaze settled on the cup of coffee. "You really came back?" he whispered, his voice trembling. He hesitated, studying her face as though to confirm that she was sincere. Then, with shaking hands, he took the coffee. Thank you so much," he murmured. Grace placed the pastry and the Christmas card beside him on the bench. "I thought these might make your day a little better," she said, her voice gentle and encouraging. The elderly man's eyes lingered on the card. He carefully opened it and read the brief message Grace had written. His lips quivered, and he blinked rapidly as though struggling to hold back tears. "You didn't have to do this," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's been a long time since anyone has shown me such kindness." Grace sat down next to him, maintaining a respectful distance. "I just wanted to help," she said softly. "Today is Christmas, no one should have to feel lonely." The elderly man exhaled deeply, cradling the warm cup of coffee in his hands. After a moment of silence, he spoke again, his voice low and tinged with sorrow. "I just wanted to feel like part of a family, even if only for a moment." Grace's heart clenched. After a pause, she spoke. "You don't have to be alone tonight. Would you like to come to my place? I'd be happy to have someone to talk to." He looked at her, his expression a mix of surprise and doubt. "You've already done so much for me. I don't want to bother you," he said softly. "You're not a bother," Grace replied firmly. "Please, I could really use a friend. Christmas will feel warmer when shared with someone." He looked at her for a long while, his eyes brimming with emotion. Finally, he gave a small nod. As they entered Grace's modest apartment, she opened the door wide, offering a warm, friendly smile. The room, though simple, exuded a cozy charm that invited warmth and comfort. The furnishings in the apartment were mismatched, showing signs of wear. A sofa with frayed edges, a coffee table with faint scratches. Everything was neat and tidy, clearly arranged with care. The room reflected Grace's pride in creating a space that was welcoming, despite the limited means. In the corner stood a small Christmas tree, decorated with a few old ornaments and a string of twinkling lights that flickered irregularly, casting a soft, gentle glow. The elderly man paused by the tree, his gaze lingering on it for a while. One of the lights had come loose and hung precariously from a branch. He reached out and gently adjusted it, securing it back in place. The tree looked a little brighter, and a faint smile appeared on his face. Grace noticed he was standing by the tree and smiled. She gestured toward the sofa. "Please make yourself comfortable, I'll prepare the meal, it won't take long." He nodded and sank into the old armchair near the tree. Grace moved into the small kitchen, softly humming a song. As she worked, the elderly man's eyes wandered around the room. A pile of papers on the side table caught his attention. Hesitant, he reached for them. It was an overdue electric bill, stamped in bold red letters, "Past due." Beneath it, other envelopes, each bearing a similar notice, with the amounts owed marked in the corners. His hands trembled as he placed the bills back in their place. His gaze turned toward the kitchen, where Grace hummed and prepared the meal. She moved with purpose, dividing leftover ingredients into small containers and setting aside just enough for their meal. Though the task was simple, it clearly showed that every bit of food had been carefully measured, a testament to the frugality and hardships of her life. The elderly man leaned back in the chair, lost in thought. This young woman, despite facing clear difficulties, had shown him kindness without hesitation. She had spent her own money to bring him a meal and welcomed him into her home, expecting nothing in return. His heart tightened with gratitude and admiration. When Grace returned with 2 steaming bowls of tomato soup and 2 plates of roasted sweet potatoes, she handed him a bowl with a warm smile. "Let's eat, it's nothing fancy, but it's warm and filling with a little Christmas spirit too," she said, sitting down across from him. The elderly man accepted the bowl with a grateful nod, his hands trembling slightly as his gaze fell on the golden brown coating of the sweet potatoes. "You've already done so much for me," he said quietly, his voice choking. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to repay me," Grace replied, her voice gentle but firm. "Kindness doesn't require repayment, that's how the world should work." The elderly man looked at her, his eyes shining. For the first time in a long while, he felt the true meaning of Christmas. Not through material gifts or grand gestures, but through the quiet kindness of a stranger who had given him something far more precious. They ate in silence for a long while, the warmth of the meal seeming to spread between them. The elderly man glanced at Grace, his brows furrowed in thought. He had noticed the overdue bills earlier and couldn't ignore the signs of struggle in her modest but tidy apartment. Setting his spoon down, he gently broke the silence. "You're very kind," he said softly, "but it seems like life is being difficult for you." Grace hesitated for a moment, her gaze dropping to the plate of sweet potatoes between them. She seemed reluctant, as if she didn't want to burden him with her troubles. Finally, she sighed and gave a small, apologetic smile. "I don't usually talk about it," she admitted. "I don't want anyone to think I'm making excuses or seeking sympathy." The elderly man shook his head gently. "Sometimes sharing can ease the burden, even just a little. Go ahead, I won't judge you." Encouraged by his sincere words, Grace began to speak, albeit hesitantly. She started to explain her situation. Grace had once worked at a large company where the workload was overwhelming and employees were frequently overworked without recognition. When she spoke out about the unfair treatment and questioned some of the company's practices, she had hoped for positive change. Instead, she was suddenly fired. To make matters worse, the company refused to pay her for the work she had completed. Left with no other options, Grace had been living off her savings and taking on small freelance jobs online to cover basic expenses. Despite her best efforts, finding stable work remained a challenge, and each day felt like a battle just to get by. The elderly man's expression softened with empathy as he listened to Grace's story. After a moment, he spoke quietly. "You've endured so much, but you still have the strength to help others. Don't lose hope." Grace nodded slightly, her eyes dropping to her hands. "I've thought about fighting back," she said quietly, her voice heavy with exhaustion, "but I just can't. With everything going on, I've already struggled enough. I just hope to find a new job and get things back to normal." The elderly man looked at her, his gaze contemplative yet firm. It seemed as if he wanted to say something more, but hesitated. Finally, he smiled warmly and said, "You've done so much for me today, more than I could ever repay. Just remember, sometimes help comes when we least expect it." Grace tilted her head, slightly puzzled by his words, but too tired to probe further. She simply smiled faintly, thinking it was just his way of expressing thanks. Their conversation gradually shifted to lighter topics, filling the space with a sense of ease. Before long, the elderly man stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He thanked her once more, and asked if he could leave for the evening, giving her a thoughtful, gentle smile. He walked out the door, leaving Grace sitting alone in the quiet room, reflecting on the unexpected connection they had formed. An hour later, Grace sat at her desk, focused on her freelance work. The room was silent, save for the occasional sound of the keyboard clicking. She hoped this project would bring her closer to stability, But her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. Startled, she looked at the clock. It was late, and she hadn't been expecting anyone. A sense of unease crept in as she stood, hesitating for a moment before slowly opening the door. When the door opened, Grace stood frozen. Four sharply dressed attorneys stood there, their expressions warm yet serious. Behind them was the elderly man, his once friendly smile now tinged with a quiet resolve. In his hand he held an envelope wrapped in decorative paper. "Good evening, Grace," he said softly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I wanted to see you again." Grace blinked, her gaze briefly passing over the elderly man before shifting to the group of lawyers. "What's this about?" she asked softly. The elderly man stepped forward and handed her the envelope. "This is for you," he said. "You were kind to me when I needed it most, and now it's my turn to help you." Grace stared at the envelope, her hands trembling. "I don't understand," she whispered. "I didn't do this for anything in return." "You don't have to," he replied with a small, knowing smile. "It's because of that kindness that you deserve this. Go ahead, open it." Grace hesitated, then slowly opened the envelope. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw the money inside, a sum so large it could erase all the hardships she had faced. She looked up at him, her voice choked with emotion. "I can't accept this, it's too much." The elderly man shook his head gently. "This isn't just about money," he said, his voice calm. "I know about your struggles, about the unpaid wages, about the battles you've fought alone." He stepped aside and gestured toward the attorneys. "These are my lawyers, the best in my firm. They'll take your case and make sure you get what you deserve. You won't have to fight alone anymore." Grace stared at him, her mind spinning. Then, it hit her, a wave of realization. The man she had seen as fragile just hours ago was the president of a prestigious law firm. His quiet strength and influence were far greater than she had imagined. She turned to the attorneys, their calm professionalism offering her a sense of relief, as though the weight on her shoulders had already begun to lift. Months later, Grace stood outside the courthouse, holding the final documents from her lawsuit. She had won, and the company was forced to pay back every penny they owed her. The relief was overwhelming, but it wasn't just the victory that brought peace. It was the support of the man who had entered her life on Christmas Eve. He had kept his promise, and with his help, Grace's life had taken a turn she never expected. Her struggle had ended, and she couldn't help but feel an immense sense of gratitude toward the stranger who had changed her entire world. Looking back at him, Grace realized that the kindness she had shown him had been the spark that ignited everything. This Christmas, not only had she received, but she had also come to understand that giving is a priceless gift. This story serves as a reminder that sometimes, even a small act of kindness can change a life. If you were in Grace's shoes, would you be willing to help a stranger? And if you've ever received kindness from someone else, how did it change you? Share your thoughts or story in the comments. Your voice could inspire others. If this story touched your heart, don't hesitate to share it with friends and family to spread the message of compassion and hope. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared with the intention of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any mistakes, kindly overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.